All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to move on to Chapter 9. So this will be the first video of Chapter 9. And we're actually now in the home stretch of the whole course, so we're pretty much getting to the end. And this chapter, we're going to now start talking about what I just call metaphysics. So now technically we've been talking about metaphysics the whole book, right? So the reason I just call this metaphysics, just a very general term, didn't really know what else to call it. But what we're going to focus on in the next two chapters, we're going to talk more about what goes on in the unseen realm or the metaphysical realm. And we're going to talk about it in a slightly different way, but we're going to talk about it mainly on a larger scale and in terms of what I consider to be the most fundamental law of the whole universe, and that's the law of manifestation. Now, I know that a lot of Christians don't really like that term, but I think that's because you've largely heard it used in a way that isn't focused on God. And so anything not focused on God is pretty much evil, right? So if it's not of God, then it is what God is not, right? Which is evil, everything bad, right? And I'm going to talk more about that later. But we're going to talk about the law of manifestation in the way that I believe is the correct way to apply it, right? Which is not based on selfishness and escapism and things like that. It's based on bringing the Spirit of God into your life and pretty much having God's Spirit direct you, right? And bring in the blessings of God and things like that. And you would manifest the will of God in reality in this world. So I'm going to go more into that. And that I believe is the proper way to use the law of manifestation. Negative entities never tell people that because they want them to use it in a selfish way when they're deceiving them. And we'll get into all of that later, right? But yeah, so we're going to talk about metaphysics more in a much more general way. We're going to talk we're going to talk about it on a larger scale. We're going to tie it back to a local scale too. We're going to talk about it in a larger scale way and as it relates, and we're going to mainly do that by relating it to the law of manifestation. Now, we're going to go over all this math in a moment. We're not going to do math in the video, but there's a reason I bring this up. But, I just want to mention that I didn't want to talk about these topics until now because I wanted to cover all the other topics that we've been talking about in the book. So we talked about God, we talked about prayer, negative entities, and psychic abilities. And we've been talking about spirituality and metaphysics with all those things too. But now I want to tie them all together, right? So we're going to pretty much tie together everything we learned about in these topics in the next two chapters, and we're going to learn about some other stuff. But we're pretty much going to bring it all together. And actually, I should mention, the book was actually originally meant to end at chapter 8. But, so I had an experience, right? And I told you about a new book. I might talk about that now. I haven't decided how much detail I want to go into with it because it's not super important. But yeah, around this time I had my sleep apnea. That's when I first experienced it, and then some other stuff happened, and I basically ended up writing chapter 9 and 10. So basically, I came up with a lot of these ideas after the book was already done, and so I really wanted to talk about them after, I covered all those topics, because they really use all of them to a degree. So that's why I didn't want to cover these topics earlier. But so now we're pretty much going to bring in everything we talked about in these next two chapters. And we're going to, in this chapter, we're mostly going to set everything up. And then in chapter 10, the next chapter, we're going to really put it all together. Which we're kind of going to talk about a lot of the topics we already spoke about. But we're going to talk about it in a different framework. Actually, that's where this comes in. So let me move on to this now. So what is all this math? Well, I set up this math here, like I said, not because we're going to do any math, but just to set up kind of an analogy. This is kind of how I think about it. So, so this, of course, so if you're into physics at all, right, this is the equation this is Newton's second law. So this is the second law, which just means net force is equal to mass times acceleration. You would use that to set up an equation of motion. So the equation of motion is just the equation you would use to determine how something moves, right? And with this, you would set up a force diagram, calculate all your forces on an object, add them all up, and you get the net force. And that's going to be equal to the mass of the object times its acceleration. So very simple. this is considered to be the equation that everyone pretty much starts out with when they're learning physics. This is considered to be more of an introductory form of physics, or introductory way of setting up an equation of motion classically. Now, and when I say classically, I just mean as opposed to quantum mechanics and relativity, in which case it's a little different. But, so yeah, you would use this, when studying physics, you would start with this, you would use this equation to set up your equation of motion for some type of object. You would start with this in high school and a good chunk of undergrad college. But then, in your probably senior year of college, probably in graduate school, you would actually start using another, what's considered to be a more advanced way of setting up your equation of motion, and that's this guy. So this is called the Euler-Lagrange equation, and I think it's pronounced Euler. I just like to say the term Euler, but yeah. So this is the Euler-Lagrange equation. You would actually use this to now set up an equation of motion for a system. This is, it looks more complex, right? But this is considered to be a more advanced way of setting up your equation of motion. So L here is called the Lagrangian. That's just the kinetic energy minus the potential energy. For this theory, right, the idea is that when a particle moves, right, when a particle moves, let's say it starts in position A, or the initial position, and then it moves to a final position, and I forget how they actually realized this. I think it was Lagrange, but they realized that if you take all the possible ways an object could have moved from point A to point B, all the possible paths, right, they're called, then he realized that the path the object always takes, any way they usually do it is kind of like this. Just, not that it's super important, but, so if you have point A and point B, that's considered a path, that's considered another path, that's considered another, and so on and so forth. And I could even do something like that. It looks kind of like a wave. But you can take multiple paths. But the path that the object is always going to take between these two endpoints is the path that minimizes the action. Right? The action is considered to be, if I'm not mistaken, I haven't done this in a while. That's the whole full differential for the derivative. But so the action is considered to just be the integral between the initial point and the final point. So the sum of the Lagrangian over time, right, between the initial point and the final point. Now, what Lagrange realized is that that's possible to minimize the action. Right, so if you take the minimum of the action, and it's considered to be technically an extrema, but you just say the minima. But if you minimize the action, they realize that the path the object always takes is going to be one that minimizes this action, or has the smallest value of all these paths. Right, and if you set up the equation when you're setting up the equation for what minimizes the action, you're going to get this guy. Right, so this is considered to be the position. So the Lagrangian, I think I said the Lagrangian is considered to be kinetic energy. Excuse me. So Lagrangian is considered to be kinetic energy minus potential energy. It's gonna actually. So Lagrangian is going to depend on position, velocity. I know it's a little sloppy, but it's going to depend on position, velocity, and time. So if you take the partial derivative of the Lagrangian with respect to position, and then set that equal to the derivative with respect to time, and you take the derivative with respect to time of the partial derivative of the Lagrangian with respect to velocity, you can set up your equation of motion. Now I'm kind of going into this too much. It's not really that important. But the reason I'm setting this up is because this is considered to be a much more advanced way of setting up the equation of motion, and you would use I haven't done it too much, but I think you would set up like a diagram and configuration space, and you would use what's called degrees of freedom and things like that. But mainly, this is actually considered to be much more powerful, right? It's considered to be this can get very complicated for complex systems when you're setting up a force body diagram. And this kind of cuts through everything and just gets you right to your equation, right? So it's actually considered to be, it's more work in the beginning. So if the system is very simple, you probably don't want to use this. You would just use this guy. But if the system is very complicated, then you would use this guy. But overall, this one is considered to be much more powerful. And this is mainly the one they use in advanced physics in general. So whether it be relativity, I think it's used in general relativity to set up your equation of motion as well as quantum mechanics and much more advanced quantum mechanics. I think in relativistic quantum mechanics, they would use this guy in quantum field theory. And so this is considered to be a much more advanced way of doing this, right? So why do I set this whole thing up? What's the point in any of this? The reason I bring this up is because I wanted to say that we're pretty much going to talk about everything that we've already been talking about, right? So throughout the book. But we're going to talk about it now in a more advanced way, right? So we're going to talk about it more in terms of the law of manifestation. So in my mind, I kind of think of the two in this way, right? So far we've been talking about a lot of metaphysical principles. So we've been talking about the nature of God. We've been talking about prayer, negative entities, spiritual warfare. We've been talking about psychic abilities and chi energy and transcendental connection. So we talked about all of those principles in a more local and simple way, just based on your subconscious and, in some other factor. But now we're going to we're going to talk about pretty much the same principles. We are going to talk about some new things, but mainly in chapter 10, we're going to talk about, in this chapter too, we're going to talk about a lot of these same principles. So a lot of it isn't really going to be that new, but like I said, we are going to talk about some new things in this chapter. But mainly in chapter 10, we're not going to talk about a lot of ultimately new concepts. But what we're going to do is talk about a lot of what we already discussed. We're going to talk about it using a new kind of formalism. So it's kind of like this. So when you're setting up the equation of motion, you can use the formalism of a force diagram using this equation, which is considered to be more introductory. Or you can set up the exact same equation of motion using this formalism, which is based on the Lagrangian, right? This is considered to be more advanced, but it's much more powerful. So that's kind of how I want to set things up. We're going to talk in chapter 10, we're going to talk about the same ideas we did throughout the book, but we're going to use what I feel is a much more powerful formalism and way of discussing things. And this is ultimately how I see pretty much everything, right? Or with the formalism that I'm going to set up. So that's kind of I go through all of that to say that that's pretty much how I see it, and that's kind of the thought pattern that I kind of want you to have, or the perception I want you to have with what we discuss in this chapter and the next. So I was thinking about doing this video. I'll just do it the next video. The next video I'm going to talk about, I don't know how much detail I want to go into yet. I did put it in the book. In the book I didn't really cover that much detail either, because it's not super important, but I'll talk about the experience I had with sleep apnea. So I talked about that in book 1, chapter 14. I talked about my experience with sleep apnea. And that's, this book, I don't know if I mentioned it yet, this book was actually meant to end at chapter 8. But I learned a lot of, it was meant to end at chapter 8, then I had my sleep apnea, then I went through kind of a spiritual crisis, and then I kind of started learning a whole bunch of other ideas or theorizing about them. And then that's when I came up with the ideas for chapters 9 and 10 for these two chapters, right? So that's why I kind of wanted to cover everything before getting here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the experience I had with sleep apnea, and just for people curious, it's not super important, but that's kind of just providing a little bit of information about what happened, why I started coming to all these other ideas after I had already finished the book. But I'll discuss that in the next video. But yeah, so that's pretty much it. Just want to give an intro to this chapter and basically the rest of the book. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.